attention just for a few minutes, and then we'll go back to resume our lunch. I just wanted to welcome you. My name is Maurice McDermott. I'm President and CEO of the Witte Museum. Welcome to the Conference on Texas, and I want to thank the presenting sponsor, Elizabeth Huth Coates Charitable Foundation, for underwriting the entire conference today. We're very grateful to them. So we'll just do this, sponsor. I also want to thank the sponsors for the conference today, which is the Summerlee Foundation here today, the John and Florence Newman Foundation, Jefferson Bank, Humanities Texas, many of you are here today, Heritage Auctions, the John G. and Marie Stella Kennedy Foundation, the Vote Auction Galleries, Meta and Buhauser. You can tell they're here. Betta and Buhauser, Plains Capital Bank, and the Amy Shelton McNutt Foundation, and also for our exhibition sponsors, which is the Center for Texas Studies at Texas Christian University. And I'm stuttering here a little bit because they're more than sponsors. The Center for Texas Studies at Texas Christian University are responsible for the book that will come in a couple of weeks, and also for a powerful partner through this whole exhibition process. And we have Leanna Schooley somewhere with us today, the executive director. Thank you, Leanna, for everything you've accomplished. The Russell Hill Rogers Fund for the Arts, the Stillwater Foundation, the Carolyn and Houston Hart Fund, Ted and Sharon Lusher, the Sara E. Hart. Sara, thank you so much for being here. Fund, the Brad Brewer, and Nancy and Ted Pop. Thank you all for your support. These conferences and exhibitions are not possible without the generous support of enlightened supporters. I'm going to introduce Ron and Michael in a little bit. Please go back to your lunch, and I'll introduce them right before their talk. Thank you. So now is the time we've all been waiting for, is to hear from our curators of this amazing exhibition, Dr. Ron Tyler and Michael Duty. I can just say personally, and I think you may have heard me this morning, to say how much we at the Witte Museum are so grateful to both Ron and Michael for teaching us so much over the last 5 years that we've worked on the book and the exhibition, and how compelling and amazing it is to have this comprehensive, unprecedented exhibition at the Witte Museum this summer, The Art of Texas, 250 Years. And with that, I mean, clearly it wouldn't have been possible without two heroes of Texas art, that people would not have paid attention to our requests, and they did, and the paintings are here as a result of that, because of these two powerhouses in Texas art. So let me formally introduce them. Ron Tyler is the retired director of the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. He has also served as professor of history and director of the Texas State Historical Association and the Center for Studies in Texas History at the University of Texas at Austin, where he edited the Southwestern Historical Quarterly and the New Handbook of Texas, 6 volumes, 1996. Ron has authored and edited a number of award-winning books and articles, including Prince of the West, 1994, Audubon's Great National Work, The Visions of America, Alfred Jacob Miller, Artist on the Oregon Trail, The Image of America in Caricature and Cartoon, The Cowboy, The Big Bend, A History of the Last Texas Frontier, and finally, our own astonishing Art of Texas, 250 Years. Can't wait till it arrives here. It's going to be it's huge, I can tell you. He and his wife, Paula, who is here with us, co-authored Texas Museums, a guide in 1983. And Ron continues to research, write, and lecture, and is working on a history of lithographs related to Texas. Behind the many books that we have published here at the Witte Museum over the last 20 or 30 years is Ron Tyler, as again with Texas State Historical Association, and really our volumes, particularly by Cecilia Steinfeld, were the result of Ron's work. Michael Duty who has spent 41 years in the field of American art and history as museum director, author, lecturer, and auction specialist. He began his career at the Amon Carter Museum, along with Ron, in Fort Worth, where he served as the museum's first director of public relations and development. He also served as the executive director of the Wichita Falls Museum and Art Center and the Rockwell Museum of Western Art in Corning, New York. Michael was the founding executive director of the Idle Jord Museum of American Indians and Western Art in Indianapolis, a stunning, fabulous museum, the executive director of the California Historical Society in San Francisco, and the executive director of the National Western Art Foundation in San Antonio, Texas. Prior to launching Michael Duty Fine Art, he served as the interim managing director of the Department of Fine and Decorative Arts at Heritage Auction Galleries, who is here today, in Dallas, and served as the firm's Western art specialist. Michael continues to lecture and consult with both private collectors and museums, which again helped us have this exhibition today. With that, what happened in this exhibition? Can you let us know how this all happened, and the book as well? Here we are, Michael and Ron.
Well, thank you, Maurice. We're happy to be here. I know I can speak for Ron also. And in fact, since we're on a limited time frame, I think I just will speak for Ron and use that up. I met Ron in 1977 when I began at the Amon Carter Museum. So we've been on the same panel and the same dais and been in the same location on a number of occasions. And I remember several years ago when I was the director of the Idle-Jord Museum in Indianapolis, I asked Ron, as I often do, usually wherever I go, I at least ask him to do something for me. And he always has been very gracious, and he came up and he gave a talk for us. And then years later, we were working on another exhibition that was based on J.P. Bryan's collection, and we were going to be on the program. And he said, "Well, who's going first?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And he goes, "Well, I'm gonna go last, because last time when I was in Indianapolis and when you introduced me, you made all the points that I was going to make." I don't particularly remember that, but I thought, okay. But today, having seen a little snippet of Ron's presentation, and I know now how proficient he is and actually very creative with the PowerPoints, I said, no. I'm going to go first today because I can't stand up to that other group anyway. So we're here to talk about kind of how this exhibition came together, and maybe some personal thoughts that I have about what I hope the exhibition has done, and maybe how you'll think about it as you go through it later today or this evening. And as everyone has said, it does seem like that we started this whole project many years ago. Longer than I had even imagined when I was looking through some of our kind of early documents and records of getting to start. I actually came across, there's a title of my talk, Texas Through a Wide Angle. We'll get to that in a minute. Came across this image. This is actually little known. This is the first meeting that we had in San Antonio to put this show together, where we gathered some of the leading scholars of Texas art. It looks remarkably like a painting by Thomas Allen, which is in the Witte collection, but actually it's a photograph of us getting together. And at that first meeting, we were excited to talk about the idea of Texas art, and Ron sort of led us through an introductory session, and we discovered that Ron had some pretty high ideas for the whole process, and he was pretty determined that we were going to see it through. That once we began this journey, that we were all going to be there at the end. And I have to say that he was kind of a hard taskmaster. I don't think you knew that I had my cell phone camera running right in the middle, I think, of that first sort of pep talk that he gave us.
Somebody has to come along. Still have a job for you when we get back. series to finish it. There'll be no quitting along the way, not by me and not by you.
Well, what can I say? We had our marching orders, and I have to say that we started out with high hopes and high enthusiasm, and when he sat down, this was the reaction that he got from the assembled scholars. So, we were ready to go. And I have to point out that there were several women involved in that early show also, but they had a more professional response than some of the guys did. So we were able to start, and one of those questions that we were asking ourselves, what constitutes Texas art? It's a big, big, big subject, and how do you winnow things down? And as comedian Stephen Wright once said, you can't have everything, where would you put it? We soon found out that we couldn't have a lot of really, iconographic images from Texas because it was just going to be too difficult to get here. We decided, for instance, to pass on a Cadillac Ranch. Thought it'd be a little bit difficult to move, and we just weren't at all sure if Maurice would want us to dig up the front yard of the Witte and to reinstall it. So we didn't do that. But we did get started on this journey, and it had its great moments, and it had some ups and downs. This is a photograph my wife Laura took of me when I learned that I had one more photograph to arrange, and I was a little bit stressed at that point. But in general, what I wanted the exhibition, what I hoped it was going to accomplish, was that there's a lot of ways of looking not just at Texas art, but Texas in general. And as we went through the process of finding these works, and there's a lot of people in this room right now who helped us do that, it became very evident that you had to view Texas not through a narrow lens, but through a wide-angle lens. You could view it in various aspects and sections of Texas art and Texas itself, and you'd be accurate if you looked through it through a narrow lens. But if you look at it through the wide lens, then you see the art and the scope of the state itself. I was away from Texas for a number of years, made a big circle around the country. And one of the things that struck me as I was gone out of the state, I was a Texas expat. I looked upon it as doing missionary work throughout the rest of the country. But I found that, to my surprise, there was still a pervasive stereotype about Texas, what Texas was all about, and who Texans were, and what the state really was sort of known for. And a lot of it was kind of summed up in these sort of postcards. I thought it was interesting that Maurice's program this morning was Postcards from the Frontier. So you would see on something like this the very traditional images, oil wells, the Alamo, Longhorns. That was, surprisingly enough, a view that a lot of my colleagues around the country really still had of Texas. Now, some of this was pretty well self-inflicted. Now, this is a mural from the North Texas room of the Hall of State. And so when the Hall of State opened, a little bit after the Centennial opened, this was adorning one of the rooms. And it's actually based on a cartoon figure that a man named John Knott created for the Dallas Morning News. And this is a picture of, this is Old Man Texas. And he's embracing, on the one hand, he's embracing Fort Worth, and on the other hand, he's embracing North Texas, and you see all of the sort of accoutrements of the modern era, the engines and dynamos, and he's wrapping his arms also around what was described as a typical North Texas family, who I guess were recently arrived as immigrants from Norway, and didn't know we had that large Nordic population, in North Texas. But so of the millions of people that went through the state centennial, you could see this on one side, and then if you went just a few little ways, you would see the newly opened Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, and as Francine really pointed out to us today, you would see an image like this, Otis Dozier's The Annual Move. So you've got both of these perspectives in the space of one very kind of small geographic representation. And if you went through that whole centennial, you would see both the centennial exhibition, which did not include Frank Ray. And I think that Michael Grell will tell you about that, but there was a Frank Ray exhibition on the grounds. So you had this great dichotomy, and I think throughout the history of Texas, and if you look at different eras, you'll see some subjects, same subjects, that are approached by different artists in different eras, and you kind of get an idea of how the state's changed and certainly how the art of the state has changed. So we here have a John McStanley painting of a Tonkawa warrior on the plains, 19th century representation of Native Americans, which was very common at the time, of the Native Americans sort of as a noble savage. And then later, you have this wonderfully iconic and ironic sculpture by Luis Jimenez called The End of the Trail with Electric Sunset. And that, of course, is based, it's Jimenez's take on the very famous James Earl Fraser sculpture called The End of the Trail. It's a very different kind of look at this subject matter. And that's been, I think, a hallmark of all the art that we came across and tried to put together for this show. You've got, part of that is a painting by Reed Crowell called A Portrait of Black Cowboy. Then there is another slide, which is Charles Truett Williams' kind of whimsical sculpture called Cowboy. You'll have to go to the show and look at the actual image, and you'll see that kind of difference. Traditional subjects, Frank Ray painting an approaching herd of longhorns. Well, that's also something that's appealed to other artists throughout the ages. Pete Durjak's Red Bull. And then one of my favorite pieces is this is an untitled sculpture, but it's likened after a longhorn by Bill Riley. And so you see these same subjects, just looked at it in a very kind of different way. And if you only looked at one of them, you would get one perspective on Texas art, but if you look at all of them together, you get a greater perspective. The land, one of the primary themes of this exhibition is the land itself. It's what maybe you look at first as an artist in Texas. So you have an early painting like this by Herman Lundquist around Fredericksburg, and that kind of melds into eventually this great, and part of the Witte collection, this great Onderdonk. But then that also sets the stage for a completely different way of looking at the land through Georgia O'Keeffe and then later Everett Spruce. So you have these four artists who yes, they're all landscape artists, and that, yes, they're all looking at the Texas landscape. And in fact, some of them are looking at very similar portions of the Texas landscape, but they're looking at it in a very different way with a different perspective. And I love this one. I think everybody who's seen the show so far kind of stops and dead in their tracks, because this is it's such a great symbol of the sort of evolution of Texas landscape painting by Mel Casas. And it sort of, encapsulates the whole idea of Texas as the Bluebont painter's state. Is his statement on that. But some of the artists that we have in this show encompass those variety of viewpoints, and it's the same artist. So here's Alexander Hogue, and on the upper corner you see a painting called Neighbors, and then the other one is his depiction of the Dust Bowl. And I think that's, Hogue normally is known for these sort of very kind of desolate landscapes, but you can see also that he had another perspective on Texas and what that landscape was all about. Some artists would look at very similar territories again and come up with very different kinds of perspectives. This is Jerry Bywater's Where the Mountains Meet the Plains. I think one of these days, I'll just make a plug now, there needs to be the new and definite, maybe Francine can do this in her retirement years, the definitive exhibition of Jerry Bywater. What a great figure in Texas art, not just as an artist, but also as a writer and also as a museum director. And then just very close to where that painting was done, William Lester's Old Fort Davis, which actually shows, I believe, the fort before it became a National Historic Site. And this was in the kind of disrepair it was in before it came to be restored. And then you have the changes in the landscape, which is also the changes in the fabric and the sort of framework that directs Texas in general. Here's Florence McClung's vision of Glen Rose. Just behind that mountain, they're building the nuclear reactor, I think, so you don't quite see that. But it is interesting to think about that landscape in terms of what it looks like now, and in terms of how it's being utilized now. Here's, again, Jerry Bywater's called Texas Subdivision. So you can see, this is in the late 30s, you can see how the state is changing and how the use of the land is changing. And so you've got, you know, the sort of beginning, I think that's probably the beginning of McKinney. And here's a road sign that shows you where McKinney is, between Denton and McKinney, by Corrine Spellman. And I think that's and Francine talked about that this morning. I think it's a wonderful painting to show us the transition that the state is going through and has continued to go through. And so you have, you know, building of subdivisions, you have the road signs that are coming up, and you have Ralph White's version of the highway from Austin to San Antonio. Many of you may have driven that highway to get here. It's basically I-35 before it was I-35. Although at the speed at which they're going would probably not match the speed that you would go on I-35 now. You'd have to get out to the new toll road to do that. And that leads to different use of the land. This is a refinery in Fort Worth by Patty East. So you're seeing the state change, you know, gradually, dramatically through the course of time, but we're still in Texas, and we're still looking at this land that we think we know so well, but it's really been our artists. I think the irony is that the most accurate, I think, ideas and the most accurate images of the continuing evolution of Texas have been through the eyes of our artists. And that's the group that has shown us how things are changing and continue to change. The way people work, for instance, what they do for a living. You know, early on, you know, it's very much an agricultural-based society. This is called Gleaners of the South. And also, of course, the ubiquitous Cowboy by W.H. Dunton. Actually, it's called Old Texas. The ubiquitous Cowboy was a subtitle that he didn't use, but seems to be appropriate. A wonderful painting, I think. It's as much a cowboy painting as it is an exercise in artistic composition with all these great shapes and colors and shades. Another kind of work in Texas, this is called a Galveston Dockworker. Does anybody know who this is? This is the former heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, who was the first African-American heavyweight champion in the world. Art was a way of working also. And so you have here two versions, again, of this similar subject. The artist on the right is called, it's the corner of my studio, and the other one is just my studio. And you have to sort of kind of look to see that this is an easel here by Marjorie Johnson. And I think that's interesting to see these two artists that are, you know, separated by many, many decades, still kind of portraying the same sort of subject matter. And I think this sort of thing also leads to the fact that whereas early Texas artists were explorers, they were reporters, they were documentarians, we came to a point where you have art being produced for art's sake. You have art just being made as art. So you've got Perry Nichols' Frames and Crystals and the great Jesus Morales here with called Vanishing Edge. It's an earlier poet and then a later sculpture. I wanted to sort of finish up with, again, to show the diversity of how a similar subject has been treated through the ages, is to look at 3 or 4 paintings depicting women in Texas. And this is an early painting by Samuel Seymour Thomas called Weighing the Puppy. And one of the things I love about this, yes, it is a portrait of the little girl, but what I love most is the mom here, who is wondering, what is going on with that little girl in that basket? What is she doing to my offspring? Then you have Grace Spalding Johnson on the left, which is a wonderful, ornate portrait, and then on the right, again, it's a partial of Dixon Reeder's painting called Sara with the Ace of Spades. There's a kind of a long hallway to her left. Again, you'll see that this afternoon. A striking portrait, I think, by Manuel Acosta called Yolanda, which has this great sort of presence, kind of a Mother Earth figure. And then I think one of Tom Lee's very best paintings called Sara, which is a portrait of his wife, which is almost life-size, and you have this luminosity about her, which just kind of shines through and sums up his feelings about her, but I think also sums up his feelings about the landscape itself. And finally, we end with a painting by Dorothy Hood, which is actually, the original painting is larger than that screen, and this is called Clouds. So you end up with this vision of Texas from above. So you've gone from the very literal side of Texas when you're looking at people who came here very early on, portraitists and historical painters, to an abstraction which encompasses the entirety of the Texas sky. And I'm always reminded that back when I was at the Carter, one of my jobs was to take people around to the museum, and we had a lot of foreign visitors, and the first thing they always would say is they got off a plane from the East or from Europe, they would say, I just can't imagine the sky. The sky here is just fantastic. And I think you look at this Dorothy Hood painting and you get that idea of the power. So what I want you to take away with you when you go through the exhibition, whether it's today and your first time or whether you come back, which I hope you will. And I think Marissa's hoping that each of you attend the exhibition a minimum of 522 times, which is a couple times a day. And then you tell an equal number of friends about it also. Is the diversity of the art that you will see, the diversity of the great variety of the ways in which artists have explored Texas, because those pictures, those independent pictures all brought together as part of the sort of grand panorama of what the state is all about. And that's what I want. I want Texas through a wide angle. So I want you to travel is that, don't send those postcards of come visit Alamo, of San Antonio to see the Alamo. Send those postcards that you get from the Witte shop of the paintings here and of the art here. And then that's what we're trying to, I think, present to Texas and non-Texans as a group, and and be kind to the non-Texans, because they don't know how ignorant they are, and you have to kind of school them in that sense. And I think that this is an exhibition that I hope will do that. and then I'll turn it over to Ron. You know, we probably could have had the catalog done and finished, but we're all about suspense. And we wanted to have a little anticipation. I mean, anybody can go to an exhibition opening and have a catalog. But not every show makes you really want to come back and get the catalog. But I do urge you to do so when it comes out, because there are these wonderful writers, many of whom are here at these tables, and they all did a great job, and they all are experts in a specific area of the art of Texas and did a great job. So you've got something else to look forward to also. Thank you.
Michael, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. And for sure, next time I go first. He said I look like John Wayne. I'm not sure about that. No. How did you do it? Ah, there we go. When I finished this project several weeks ago, Paula said, "How do you feel?" Well, Paula asks me how I feel all the time. How do you feel? How do you really feel? So I put together a little presentation to try to help her understand how I feel. No? With apologies, of course, to the Big Bang Theory. But yeah, I still felt kind of that way. Walking through the galleries does help me get my mind straight, though. One of the things that Michael talked about, and which I reinforce with this slide, is the variety of art that we're dealing with, the variety of artists that we're dealing with, and the many images and many approaches to this exhibition. The exhibition is organized, as Maurice pointed out this morning, along the landscape, the peopling the land, the urban area, and then in the gallery that opens tonight at home. So another approach, though, and this is the approach that I, as a historian, like to take, is the chronological approach. We talked about 250 years in Texas. We could have talked about more. This is probably the first picture that was painted in Texas after the Indian pictographs. It's a picture of a European ship painted by two of LaSalle's survivors from his ill-fated colony. And it was done about 1688. That's more than 250 years ago. We knew that picture was in the archives in Sevilla in Spain, though, and they wouldn't lend that. So we thought maybe we could get this picture of Father Margil done probably about 1760. We don't really know. It's a sort of a circa date. So in looking at pictures like this, entitling the exhibition, The Art of Texas 250 Years, I started thinking about a chronological approach and the representation of historic periods through the exhibition. So that's what I want to talk about briefly now. So this portrait of Father Margil got to be one of the earliest pictures that has anything to do with Texas history after the picture of the LaSalle ship. This picture of the massacre at Mission San Saba, done about the same time as the Father Marhil portrait. We could have timed the exhibition from this picture as well. After the Spanish period, you come into the Mexican period, and you come into the settlement by Anglo-Americans, and you have some of the first from-life portraits made in Texas. And this is a quote from Thomas Carlyle, the great biographer in 1854, talking about the value to him of a portrait. Any representation made by a faithful human creature of that face and figure, which he saw with his eyes and which I can never see with mine, is now valuable to me in talking about the individual and learning something about the individual. Portraits made from life are useful. They tell us something about the individual. This is another picture of Stephen F. Austin. Notice how it compares to this picture of Daniel Boone. Austin obviously had his portrait painted in the same pose and style as the Daniel Boone picture. Daniel Boone introduced Anglo-American people through the Cumberland Gap and into the Midwest. Austin brought the Anglo-Americans into Texas, and he saw himself as the Daniel Boone of Texas. Davy Crockett had his portrait painted in Washington when he was a member of Congress, and he didn't like the way it was going. It was being done by a well-known American artist, John Gadsby Chapman. Crockett didn't like it. He said, "You're making me look too much like a Methodist preacher." And he went out in Washington. He found an old buckskin suit. He found an old hat. He got some antique rifle, and he wanted an old hound dog. He said, not a purebred, but a mongrel, like you'd see back home on market day. And so here's the picture that's in the exhibition. Crockett's waving that old hat, and Chapman said when he came into the studio with that hat, he gave a yee-haw that he said raised the neighborhood. So that tells us something about Crockett, too, as well, a portrait made from life. Michael mentioned John McStanley and the wonderful pictures that he did from the treaty signing near Waco in 1843. The warrior comes from that treaty signing, so does the buffalo hunt picture. Stanley's a well-known American artist, and these are really among the most important pictures to come from the period of the Republic of Texas. This picture sort of introduces us to Texas statehood. It's done by William Ranney, who only missed the Battle of San Jacinto by about 2 weeks. He arrived just a little late. He joined the Texas Army and served for about 6 months. And then he, after being dismissed from the Army, spent another few months traveling around Texas and sketching. Then he went back home to New Jersey and put his sketches away. 10 years later, in 1845 and 1846, Charles Days, George Caleb Bingham, and other artists began to exhibit Western scenes in New York. And Ranney saw that these Western scenes were popular, so he went back and dug out his sketches and did several paintings from the sketches that he made in Texas, and this is one of them, done in 1846 and exhibited in New York. It's called The Lasso. It relates to the folklore about the great white steed of the prairies. The great white steed of the prairie was rumored in many newspapers to exist and could never be caught by anybody. One person even had a team of horses, had several horses all lined up, and rode one of them after the other to exhaustion and still could not capture the great white steed. Well, here, Ranney pictures the great white steed being captured. What's the significance of that? In 1846, the great white steed was Texas. Texas is coming into the Union. It has been captured after that 10-year period as a republic. So this introduces us then to Texas statehood. This wonderful picture, which Sam talked about in one of the sessions this morning, was done by a German immigrant artist to Texas, Richard Petrie. He arrived in about 1851 and unfortunately drowned in the Pedernales River in 1857. This picture was in progress when he died. It's a picture of Fort Martin Scott. Fort Martin Scott was the military post that existed in Fredericksburg, but only for a short period of time because the frontier was moving west so rapidly that they soon established another fort west of Fredericksburg, and Fort Martin Scott was decommissioned. So this picture shows the Fredericksburg community, if you will. The military commander of the post, James Longstreet. It also shows some of the scouts. This is a Delaware Indian scout and interpreter. Some of the city fathers, if you will, and an Indian woman on Mr. Longstreet's arm. And he didn't have time to finish out that picture, that portrait, but he did a portrait of the woman, and that's what she looked like when he did his portrait. But other elements of this genre painting are very important, I think, in telling us about the community of Fredericksburg and the military post, and really what Petrie was trying to say about the Texas frontier at this point in time. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a woman who is eating a morsel of some kind there. Right next to her, you see the boy reaching out of the tent and taking the bone away from the dog. In the middle, you see the baby with a torn shirt so that it appears almost to be angel wings. And then over at the right, you see a man sneaking a drink from a bottle in the person's pocket in front of him. Petrie and Lundquist wrote about the poverty of the Indians in that area. And so that's what you're seeing in this picture. It's the whole community, and he's giving you an idea of what the predicament, really, of the Indians at that time was. Also, right in the middle there is a stump. And in 19th century pictures, a stump is a sign of progress because it means people have arrived, cut down the timber to build their houses or to build fires. And so there's progress taking place in Fredericksburg, but the Indians are not being included in it. It's really a poignant comment on the frontier at that time and a very different view of the Indians in the 1850s. Civil War, Iwanski painted this wonderful picture of Sam Maverick Jr. He was a member of Terry's Texas Rangers. Also at the same time, Lundquist was out painting the Texas landscape. This picture of Enchanted Rock was done in 1864 during the Civil War. And in the upper left-hand corner, I've included a picture of the Confederate massacre of the group of Germans who were trying to go to Mexico so they could join the Union Army. It was done by a member of the German community, Mr. Klaus, a few years later in 1888, after he had had time to collect information from some of the families and to try to find out what has happened. And what has happened is that the 61 Germans, I believe, have been pinned against this steep bank by the Nueces. The Confederates are firing on them from the trees over there, and they were all killed. So it's called the massacre at the Nueces. Post-Civil War Texas. Well, there was a lot going on in post-Civil War Texas. There was huge immigration into Texas. Texas was the only Confederate state that really wasn't devastated in the war, so it was in a position to receive immigrants who could immediately go to work. The state had not been devastated as other southern states had. Thomas Allen was a Bostonian who spent a couple of years in the San Antonio area. And of course, you've seen this picture of our conference to open this art exhibit. And he also did this wonderful picture called The Toilers of the Plains, of the cartmen who are bringing goods between San Antonio and the coast. And Olmsted, in his book, talks about these cartmen and how they would simply drive their oxen to death. And when one of them died in the traces, they would unhitch him, leave his body there, and hitch up another one and move on. So you see, oops, sorry. There. You see buzzards circling in the sky, following the train in anticipation of that happening again. Allen stayed in Texas for a couple of years, then went back to Boston, became a banker, later served as president of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and contributed some of his Texas paintings to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Another German immigrant was Julius Stockfleth. He made a living painting portraits of ships in Galveston, and here you see the Charles Clark. But he also painted this wonderful picture of the Texas Capitol in 1888, just after it was constructed. And you can see how thoroughly it dominates the townscape of Austin. and I'm moved to say just as thoroughly as the skyscrapers now dominate it, because you can hardly see the Capitol in Austin today. A few years later, Frederick Remington, by then a very well-known American artist, visited Texas on his way to Mexico. And he had heard about John S. Rip Ford, a former Texas Ranger, a doctor. He got his nickname in the Mexican War because as a doctor he pronounced rest in peace on so many soldiers, so everybody started calling him Rip. And so he had a conference with Rip Ford, and he said, Colonel Ford can tell stories that will make your eyes hang out on your vest. And he converted some of those stories into paintings. And one of them, of course, is the drawing of the black bean for the Mier expedition, but this one is not quite as well known. It probably comes from the Comanche attack on the buffalo hunters in the Panhandle when Billy Dixon made his famous rifle shot of about a mile in distance that knocked one of the Indians off of his horse. And the Indians had not confronted such firepower before, and they've been thrown into confusion in this painting, and it's called The Episode of the Buffalo Gun, or other possible titles. But he also wrote about it in Harper's New Monthly Magazine, so it became a famous picture, just as with the Muir expedition. Now, in the latter quarter of the century, there were three people who either settled in Texas or came to Texas, and then did settle in Texas, who really had an impact on the state and on the artist. One of them is Frank Ray. He came from Illinois to Terrell in 1867. A few years later, he moved to Dallas. He studied art in St. Louis and then in in Europe, came back home and began to paint and to teach. And he taught a number of students in Dallas, meanwhile doing his own paintings, which are included in the exhibition and are wonderful statements on the Texas Longhorn. Frank Ray was, as far as I know, the only artist who actually traveled on the trail drive with the cowboys, and so he knew firsthand what the trail drive was like, and he thought the longhorn was a beautiful animal, so he painted the longhorn, not the cowboys. Well, you see a few cowboys in the picture on the right, but he's really painting the longhorns because he thought it was a beautiful animal and he loved the color. This is by Kaler, an artist who traveled to various Texas ranches and did this wonderful picture of the Reynolds Ranch in the Davis Mountains in 1896, which is at the time when Frank Ray was in his prime in Dallas. A few years later, Thomas Hart Benton picks up on the Texas cattle story with this picture of loading cattle in West Texas. And Harold Bugbee, who spent many years at the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon, did this wonderful picture of the cattle drive. And then Fred Darge of Dallas did this. I don't know if this is the prototype or the stereotype, but I like it. And it's called On the Trail. And then Charles Williams adds his sculpture of the cowboy in 1949. So the cowboy has a place in the iconography of Texas. And among Ray's students, L.O. Griffith, Alexander Hogue, Florence McClung, just a few of the many people who trained with and painted with Frank Ray. In San Antonio, you have Robert Onderdonk, really about the same time, latter quarter of the 19th century, a wonderful artist in his own right, but he also helped train young Seymour Thomas, who did the Weighing the Puppy genre painting. But his most famous student turned out to be his own son, Julian Onderdonk. And Julian Onderdonk, of course, is the artist who started the Bluebonnet School, if you will, in Texas. There were a whole series of Bluebonnet painters who followed Julian until Mel Casas sort of put the finishing touches on the Bluebonnet painting, I think, sort of the summary of the Bluebonnet painting. Jose Arpa was a member of Onderdonk's group, and he's best known for his landscapes, but I really like the portrait that he did of a young student, I think the son of Ernst Rabe, a friend of his, a very poignant portrait. And in Houston, it was Emma Richardson Cherry who taught some, but I think probably influenced many more by her example. She was an Impressionist painter. She brought modernism to Houston. And one of her students was Ola McNeill Davidson, who did this painting of the dead live oak. And then, of course, in the Panhandle, at the same time, is Georgia O'Keeffe, who is doing her form-shattering pictures of the Panhandle landscape. This is a picture of Paladero Canyon, which is loaned to the exhibition by the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon. And of course, at the same time, you have the discovery of oil and the beginning of urbanism in Texas, with Murray Bewley's picture of downtown Fort Worth, Lloyd Goff's picture of the Tower Petroleum Building, Lucille Land Lacey's picture of Temple, view from the bridge in Temple. So urbanism and modernism began to come into Texas art, Lloyd Goff's Dallas Station Yard. The Edgar Davis wildflower competitions brought some of the most important American artists to Texas. One of the ones who came was a Britisher, Dawson Watson, and he actually won the first contest with the picture you see on the right called The Glory of the Morning. But there were other important artists who participated in that contest. Dutton was one of them. In 1928, he had the Horse Wrangler, and then the following year, the painting Old Texas. Other Dallas artists, Merritt Mosey. Merritt Mosey made a painting sketching trip to Galveston, did a number of scenes in Galveston, including this one of loading cotton, and this is the one we chose for the cover of the book, as a matter of fact. And of course, the black artist Samuel Albert County did this wonderful portrait of an American dock worker. He titled it, of course, it was a portrait of Jack Johnson. The Annual Move by Otis Dozier introduces us to the Great Depression as we continue this march through our Texas history. Alexander Hoag's Dust Bowl was in Life magazine. It was a very widespread published image at the time it was done. Jerry Bywater's, of course, famous picture of two oil field girls. And in the post-war period, Bror Utter in the Fort Worth School. This is the mannequin, and it's a very, I think it's going to become an iconic picture from Bror Utter, and it's in the exhibition as well. We tried to get the Stampede from Odessa for the exhibition, but it turned out to be a huge project to get the thing moved and get it here. So we selected instead his portrait of his wife, Sara, which actually he considered to be his magnum opus, and it's been one of my favorite pictures for a long time. Everett Spruce's view of the landscape, of course, a bit more modern than what you've seen up to this point. And then we get into the mid-century modern period with artists like Robert Brucer and Seymour Fogel and Ralph White, The Road to San Antonio from Austin. I don't know, that's how I feel when I'm on I-35, Michael. That might not be moving as fast, but it's the same confusion. And then this wonderful picture by Ben Caldwell of Temple called The Gate. A very interesting artist whom I would like to know more about. And certainly one of my favorite artists as a result of this exhibition is Forrest Bess from Rockport, lived in relative isolation in Rockport, and just produced wonderful pictures, one after the other. I think he's very much in vogue right now. As you can see, as we move into the 50s and 60s, the art is becoming a little bit more cerebral and less representative, and I think that's what Frank Fried was trying to help us out with here when he produced this little picture called Climate of Opinion. Because you remember the cubicles were just coming into offices in those days, and so here you have people peeking out of their cubicles in 1964. So beginning to get a little more cerebral. Back to the History Illustrated, though, this is a wonderful mural by John Biggers called The History of Education in Morris County, Texas. The principal of the high school in Morris County did his master's thesis, as I understand it, on the history of education in the county, and he invited Biggers to come up and do a mural painting based on that study, which Biggers did. And the painting has been recently rescued from, rescued from it was taken off view for a long period of time and sort of discovered and brought back and put in good shape, and it's in the exhibition. Very important painting. And then, of course, the two Hispanic sculptors who really became American national sculptors, not just Texas sculptors, Luis Jimenez and Jesus Morales, and unfortunately both met untimely deaths, but they were at the height of their artistic powers when that happened. And finally, Robert Rauschenberg's Whistlestop. This was a picture that the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth commissioned in 1976 for the Texas Bicentennial. They commissioned work from Rauschenberg, Red Grooms, and photographer, I'll think of his name in a minute, for the Bicentennial, and they still have this, well, they have the Rauschenberg as well as the Rodeo Ruckus, which is what Red Grooms did, and they exhibit that from time to time. It's huge, though. It's so huge you can actually walk in it. You'll see the Whistlestop in the exhibition. So that chronological story, just to tell you that that is one approach to this exhibition. And when you look at it in that sense, it's not just the art of Texas, it's the story of Texas. Thank you. The most difficult decision about what not to include, boy. Well, that could have been almost anything. My tendency was to include everything, and I think Maurice will confirm that. That's why we have the exhibition over in the room in the other building for the art that we couldn't get in the first gallery. Well, it hasn't opened yet, so we'll find out tonight. I don't know, do you have a specific picture that you're...
Well, I will agree with you that one of the most difficult things was to get Ron to quit looking at art because I would get these emails and calls and say, what do you think about this? Maybe we should include this. And so I finally said, Ron, we're at the point now that you have to do like we do at my house. If you buy something new, you got to take something off the wall in order for it to fit. And he says, oh, well, at my house, we just lay up against the wall. And I've been to Ian Paula's house, and this is actually true. There were so many things that we couldn't get in. We asked for more things than we got, and for one reason or another. They were either, not available. I think for me, one of the hardest paintings that we didn't get was a painting that's in the Idlejoy Museum by Victor Higgins called Paladero Canyon, which is just a wonderful landscape. But as it turned out, the exhibition directly coincided with them opening a new gallery where they had, sort of reinstalled their permanent collection. And so we tried to get that, but we couldn't. And then there were things that were just the logistics of trying to get them here. We didn't actually try to get Cadillac Ranch, but there were other paintings that were kind of iconographic, but the people who owned them, the institutions, agreed. And so there were paintings that were absolutely essential to their educational programming. But we got a lot. So,
I did think of one that we could have gotten for the exhibition and didn't, and that's Seymour Thomas's equestrian portrait of Sam Houston. The museum was willing to lend it, but it's too big for the gallery. It has a huge frame on it. I think it's 12 feet plus a frame, so it's too big for the gallery. We couldn't get it in. So that was a miss.
Other questions? We may have stunned you. We asked for oil field girls, and I will forever bear a grudge against the University of Texas for That was one of those paintings that they just really absolutely thought that it was so essential to their educational programming that they couldn't let it go. But I think that is probably one of the, quintessential images of Texas, and that was a heartbreaker. So consequently, we're boycotting the museum.
Did James Commissioner buy that?
I believe so. Is Francine here? Because she knows that she was there for that story. Didn't Michener buy Oilfield Girls for? Yeah. So.
Becky Reese was curator there and talked to her. She was the one that discovered the Oilfield Girls and with John and Michener and Getzman and Bywaters in connection. She has good stories about that.
Just last night, Francine showed us a picture of herself and Becky and several other people who were right at that moment when they were acquiring Oilfield Girls. But I think that's a painting that so many people associate with the art of Texas. And but again, a lot of these paintings are truly icons, and so they're beloved by a lot of people. This one work, that kind of append your question, the things that we could get, that sort of surprised me. When the Texas Centennial was being organized and formed, the Centennial Commission hired an artist named Allie Tennant, and she did this great sculpture called the Tejas Warrior, which is more than life size. And if you've ever been to the State Fair and you've seen the Hall of State, it's against that blue background, and it's gilded. Well, when she was working on that, Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina asked the Centennial Commission, for permission to approach her to see if she would do a smaller version of that, and they said fine, and so she did that. And so that sculpture, which is here in this exhibition, has been in Brook Green Gardens since 1936, and I believe this is the first time that it's ever been out. So we did get some things that were sort of extraordinary, and I think we're hopefully introducing them to a much wider audience. Not to say that Brook Green doesn't have a wide audience, but to bring that back to the state, I think, is pretty remarkable.
Tell the story of the restoration of the mural.
Well, one of the great, I think, items in this exhibition that we were really proud to get is John Bigger's mural, The History of Negro Education in Morris County. And Ron told you a little bit about the origin of the painting, but it's actually owned by a local school district in East Texas, and it's on loan to the Northeast Texas Community College for 30 years. And there was an educator who both taught high school in that area and also taught at the college, who was working on a book about John Bigger's murals, and so she was sort of aware that this existed. Well, after the schools were integrated in that part of Texas, that particular school was closed down and then changed in its orientation. And the mural that had been hanging in the high school for many, many years was sort of shunted aside. And for a while, it was stored in the band building. For a while, it was actually stored under a bandstand. There was a segment of its history when it was stored outside, and it was just sort of kind of rolled up until this woman, whose name now escapes me. Sorry. Yes, exactly. Good audience, knows these things. So she kind of got wind of it, and she called Mr. Biggers, who came and took a look at it and verified that indeed it was his, and they wanted to put it back on display. And the people at the college tell this great story where the painting, as you might have guessed, it had received some damage. And so the two of them went down to a local Walmart and bought some duct tape. And I actually came in and did some repair work on it. Now, subsequently, a very fine conservator in Dallas named Helen Haupt has done extensive work on it, and it's in great, pristine condition. And we're so fortunate to have it here. My wife and I were there when it was loaded onto the truck to bring it to San Antonio, and it was no easy task to get it here, but they did a great job. I mean, it was just, they were very professional. It was just great to see it. So that's one of my favorite things, because I just didn't think we'd be able to take that. The great thing about that painting now is that it's in part of the student center in the library, and they built a special classroom around it. And many of the teachers at the college, I mean, teachers who have nothing to do with art, will bring their classes to that particular classroom so that their students will have an opportunity to see that. So that painting has been integrated into the kind of the whole campus life, and they all really appreciate it. And I can tell you, when we were moving it, there was some interest in where it was going and what was going to happen to it. Yes?
Speaking of saving art, is this one of the pieces that was saved from that fire downtown?
Yes, in fact, Maurice told us that story just a little while ago. Is talk about a harrowing incident, and it's the only story that I know of where a museum CEO was, running into a fire to save a painting, and thank goodness they did. It wasn't me, it wasn't Ron. So. Other questions? I guess we're finished. Thanks.
Just a bit of housekeeping. Our next session starts in about 15 minutes. And don't forget that we have a wonderful reception planned at 5:30. You all are all welcome to join us. And we will have both galleries open. And thank you so much for your participation.